And for those of you that are new to my channel, if you have questions the first time you're joining me here today, we like to host this typically twice a month, usually the first Thursday of the month and then the third Thursday of the month. And the form to submit your questions in advance is inside your student dashboard. So when you're able to submit your questions in advance, I'm able to, it pushes them to the top of my list. And then new to my channel, I have more opportunity to address them in greater detail. And then, of course, I like to create moments of rest here on the call together so that you can ask me questions. Those of you that are joining me here live and in real time, you can ask me questions and I can get them answered for you. Anything that we don't address here today on the call, I will try to address next time we meet. So I try to bump it up that way. The other option for my students is if you are in the Facebook group, and if you're my students, you have access to the group, you can also pose questions and tag me, and I typically try to respond within 48 hours. Okay. All right. So I thought I would just dive right in here today. And again, as questions are popping up or thoughts and reflections, please feel invited to type it there in the comments. And I will try to address them as I receive them. Okay. So the first question that we received, what is anger, energetically speaking, and how does that function? So in all of my courses, I like to conceptualize emotions as energy moving through the body. And our emotions typically indicate to us what our proximity or our alignment might be in proximity to the opinion, the essence of your higher self or your spiritual self. So what would anger be then? So anger then would be force, like in Star Wars, it's the force. Anger is just an intensity. It is a frequency of energy. And what creates force? Well, force is created by tension and momentum. So what creates tension and momentum? Well, conflict, right? And that is two things pushing together or against each other can create conflict. Constriction, or we might call it implosion. So when something is being forced in, down, it's being pinched or squeezed, repressed, pushed down, that creates force and tension. And of course, explosion. So this is when there is a lot of intensity, but there's no containment or direction. There's too much force, so there's no way to channel it. And that is sort of like an avalanche, right? Gains more and more and more, and it gets increasingly chaotic. So these are different ways in which the energy might express itself. In terms of how it functions, based on our attachment styles, our personalities, our conditioning, the way that our environments respond to us, our minds make sense of the energy moving through our bodies, anger being big energy and usually uncomfortable energy moving through our bodies because it's imploded, exploded, or in conflict in some way, shape, or form. So our mind tries to make sense of that energy by channeling it into some archetype for how to cope with that, right? An archetype being a pattern, a recognizable pattern, collection of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that we use with enough frequency that we can call it a pattern, right? And so I like to talk about anger in terms, I call this the 9 faces of anger, but these are just 9 anecdotal ways in which I've observed people channeling their anger. And so the first one is the anger addict. So the anger addict would be someone who uses anger as a way to feel powerful and in control, and it masks deeper feelings of helplessness that they might carry. So anger is sort of like their immediate and go-to reaction to any sense of threat. And because it makes them feel like they have a greater sense of agency, it makes them feel safe and protected, and they're not going to apologize for that, right? Then we have someone that is explosive, but then instantly apologizes or becomes very apologetic later. So it's sort of similar to the anger addict in that they too struggle to regulate their emotions, but they're going to experience intense remorse afterwards. They start to flood emotionally, and so they're switching between angry outbursts, but then they're switching between intense guilt or shame about it. Right? Then the third one I think of as passive aggressive, and it's just like what it sounds like. So this is someone who avoids direct confrontation and then instead expresses their anger in these kind of subtle and subversive ways. They might agree to things really begrudgingly, only to sabotage them later or just like fail to show up, right? Then number 4, we have a habit of turning our anger inwards. And this is usually rooted in early childhood experiences where it just was unsafe to express our anger. And so what we end up doing is suppressing it, right? We sort of turn it in on the self, we internalize it, we blame ourselves. And what happens is that becomes typically depression. Anxiety, yes, but depression. And because we are carrying and internalizing deep feelings of inadequacy and usually self-loathing. The number 5 would be the blame game, right? So these are folks who play the blame game. They avoid taking responsibility for anything. And so their anger becomes a form of projection, right? They project it onto others. I'm not angry, you're angry. It's not my anger causing the problem, it's your anger causing the problem. And so that prevents them from confronting their own fears of inadequacy, fears of failure, or fears of being unlovable, right? It's not me, it's you. Then number 6 would be the angry connector. So the angry connector, this is someone who uses anger as a means to connect with people. For whatever reason, anger was what allowed them to feel a sense of love and connection in the home, even if it was uncomfortable. So, when you were having a fight, that may have been the only time that you actually felt seen and acknowledged. So without conflict, you might feel like you are unseen or emotionally abandoned, right? So you're going to cause fights in order to feel seen and emotionally acknowledged. So that's the angry connector. Number 7, the vengeful sadist. So this is someone who thrives on retaliation. They take pleasure in the idea of revenge. They don't just fantasize about getting even. They act on these fantasies and they feel empowered by causing pain or harm to somebody else. And usually it's another form of projection that drives this, because if you feel pain, then you must acknowledge that I exist. You must acknowledge my power. You cannot ignore me, right? So it's people who have sadistic tendencies have extremely early wounds, extremely early and existential wounds. Then we have number 8, the cool head. So a cool head will find all expressions of anger really unacceptable. And so they will detach from any person or any situation that is likely to call up that anger. As a result, they have not done any work in organizing how they handle anger. So it really just gets cut off. And oftentimes these are folks that experience a sense of disconnect from their bodies because it's the body that winds up holding it. And so while they are avoiding anger, at least consciously speaking, it has to go somewhere. So they may develop a lot of psychosomatic symptoms as a result of suppressing that emotion. Migraines, stomach pain, back pain, things like that. Issues of the urinary tract. I don't know if you're familiar with Louise Hay, but she used to say people who have bladder issues and digestive issues are struggling with anger because they are pissed and they are holding on to it. And then the last one I call steady on. And so this is represented by secure attachment, a secure way of handling anger. So this is someone who does know how to express their anger in a healthy way. They find appropriate channels for it. They're able to use feeling statements and take accountability for their part in whatever is making them angry, rather than blaming other people for the situation. They also understand that anger is just a natural part of life and that it clues you in to something about your needs, your boundaries, and your wants, right? And it doesn't have to threaten the security of a relationship. It's just letting you know where one person's reality is butting up against another person's reality, and it's time to dig in and find out how can we make space for both, right? So this is just one way to kind of conceptualize the way that we channel anger and how it functions for us. But again, I just going back to the beginning, emotions are energy moving through our body, and anger is a big emotion. It's a big energy, but it's just like the force. You can channel that energy for constructive means, or you can channel that anger towards destructive means. So if we are channeling anger constructively, usually it means we are regarding it as a road sign pointing us in the direction of what is my deeper needs and wants and boundaries here that I need to get clear on, right, and take action on. We can also use anger as a form of activism, for example. Anger allows us to identify and correct dysfunctions in a system, right? Whether it is in the internal system, a relational system, a family system, a larger societal system, right? Anger is cluing us into there's something there that needs to be looked at, and we can choose then to become part of the problem or part of the solution, right? And so then anger can assume constructive or destructive forms. So I hope that helps answer that question. For those of you joining, again, as you're listening, you're invited to post your questions there in the chat. I will take pauses to acknowledge the chat. Otherwise, I'm just going to go through the questions I received in advance, and I will take moments of rest to check in. Okay. So another question we had. When does an avoidant partner's love finally outweigh their fear? What is the fulcrum of change? Okay, it's a good question. So change happens when the desire for what could be outweighs our fears of what has been. So in my experience, that shift doesn't really occur without connecting to something transcendent, a force beyond our immediate fears and wounding. And I believe these moments of transcendence are really part of our soul's curriculum, and that guides us towards where we need deeper healing. So for an avoidant partner, the fulcrum of change is when the possibility of a fulfilling and secure relationship becomes more compelling than the emotional risk involved. But it's important to recognize that some people are not here to realize that potential in relationships. Their journey might be to explore unfulfilled potential. And from a soul perspective, that's equally valuable information. Not everyone is meant in this lifetime to fulfill what's possible in relationships, which probably means they are instead meant to be a catalyst for growth in others because of the contrast that they create as a result of it. So ultimately, change is possible when one person is ready and willing to embrace growth. And so that willingness lets you know that they are most likely meant for it. Right. That's a good question. Hope that's helpful. Let's see. So my partner broke up with me, citing an argument from 6 months ago. They won't let me correct or fix it. Any advice? Okay. So there's a little more detail. I recently broke up with my fearful avoidant boyfriend of 2 years just before my birthday. He mentioned an argument from 6 months ago when we argued about gardening, but it was really about my wanting to feel more connected. When we broke up, he cited this argument as the catalyst, and in retrospect, I did notice subtle withdrawals since then. I'm deeply grieving and considering writing him a letter for closure, not to win him back, but to express my perspective and acknowledge the miscommunication. I'm unsure if it will help either of us. Any guidance or advice? Okay. So in this case, the original argument might have seemed like it was about gardening, which was the activity it sounds like the argument was about on the surface. And that narrative or that story might serve this partner's protective parts or defensive mechanisms to let you think that that's what he thinks it was about. But it's more likely that even then, he knew the argument was more about connection. And perhaps that you were asking for a deeper level of intimacy than he was really comfortable with. So the issue was likely to be kind of building up and simmering and boiling underneath the surface before that day. And the issue around the gardening, or whatever the activity was that you were doing, was just a pin that finally popped the balloon. And when that happens, it can turn on really deeply buried triggers from someone's past, especially if they are fearful avoidant. And so it's likely that in this case, your bids for connection sparked whatever that original wound might have been, and it cut them so deeply that from that moment on, having been triggered in that way, they had no intention of letting you repair it. And so when someone has these kinds of really deep emotional defenses, particularly again with fearful avoidance, the pain feels too vulnerable to share. And they don't want to give you a chance to fix it because that means they're giving you a chance to do it again. So they shut down and they start to withdraw, oftentimes in subtle, sort of passive aggressive ways initially. Even if on the surface they're telling you that everything is fine and they're plastering a smile on their face, internally something switched off and they're really not willing to turn it on again. And unless, of course, they're willing to make a lot of effort, they have a lot of motivation for change, and they're willing to explore increasing consciousness around what that trigger was, and they want to turn it back on again. Their loving feelings back on again. Now, the frustration you feel in being a partner to someone like this, it's probably a reflection of the same frustration your partner felt, that deep original pain that they felt and experienced when this mechanism was created inside of them, right? And which led them to erect such thick and impenetrable emotional walls. So now you are taking in their pain almost as if by osmosis, right? And so from their perspective, allowing you to course correct or to fix things means that they would need to expose this original wound, right? And that's just terrifying because that means you now have the opportunity to hurt them again. So it's not about fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice. It's fool me once, you're done. And I'll end it when I feel like I'm ready, not a moment more and not a moment less. Because remember, for fearful avoidant partners, power dynamics and control are really at the basis of their conundrum, right? So it's not really about the relationship itself being beyond repair. It's really about them being unable to face the emotional risk involved in repairing it. You can't repair something if they don't tell you it's wrong. You can't accept an invitation that has not been extended, right? And so that's the kind of internal block that they need to work on for themselves. It's an inside job. And no matter how much you might want to repair that dynamic, to work on the healing and the opening up again, it has to come from them, right? You can write that letter and you can explain yourself until you're blue in the face. And by all means, if that makes you feel better because there may be some element of self-advocacy that you're being called to step into as a result of calling in this partner, because they're clearly not advocating for themselves, right? They're shutting themselves down. So now in the face of their lack of self-advocacy, you are being called to advocate for yourself. So if writing that letter is part of stepping into that lesson for you, by all means, go ahead and do it. But don't write it because you think that that's somehow going to change something for them, because it's not likely to change anything on their part. Not if they have this kind of mechanism going on and they're not willing to work with it. Because understanding you and your motivations and clarifying the miscommunication, that's not the issue here. In fact, I doubt it was actually a miscommunication. It sounds like he's creating confusion to obscure the fact that he knows this was about connection. He probably knew about it all the way leading up to that, because you said you were dating 2 years, broke up with you after an argument 6 months ago, which means that You were together about a year, a little bit more than a year before this argument happened. And that's usually when attachment mechanisms start turning on, right? So it's actually not that long of time. So understanding you and your motivations and what drives you is really not the issue here. Because when someone has a punishing protector like this inside of them, there's an extremely vulnerable wound that is very deeply buried, very deeply guarded. And unless your partner is aware of it and interested in being in conversation with it, they're not going to let you in. And you're going to continue to feel guilty for something that they never made you aware of. And so now you know how their inner child feels. That's how they have this strong protector that keeps punishing that inner child to keep it in line, right? So they have to choose to let you in. That's an inside job. So this is a painful one because you really have no control over this. What you do have control over is how you're going to show up and advocate for yourself in this situation and let go of the idea that there's something you could have done. Not unless they allow you to, and this person has not allowed you to. So it's on them. This is, and there's likely to be a pattern in this person's past of sort of passive aggressively pulling away and not letting people in and not expressing what's really going on with them, and then finding a way of making it your fault and then sort of sabotaging the relationship, right? And blaming it on you. It's a very clever mechanism. You know, that part inside of him is very sophisticated. It's done its job well for a really long time. And, you know, unless he's in conversation with that part, it's going to continue pulling the strings behind his curtain. There's nothing you can do, unfortunately. But that's very painful. And my heart goes out to you. Thank you for asking that question. Some comments. Can an avoidant attachment style person and anxious personality type heal together? Sure. So it's not about, you know, having an attachment style doesn't make you one way or the other. People, no matter what your attachment style is, we all exist on a spectrum of readiness for change, right? So there's the pre-contemplative phase where we don't actually know what's going on. We're sort of just reacting to our inner impulses. We are, I don't know why, I just feel it and I want to feel justified in this feeling. So I'm just going to do whatever I need to do to satisfy it. Not a lot of awareness going on, right? Pre-contemplative. Contemplative, we're starting to notice some patterns. We're feeling really uncomfortable. We've experienced heartbreak. Don't want to experience that again. We start recognizing patterns. Now we're contemplating what's going on, right? Then we have preparation. Well, now I've thought about it for a little bit and I've come to some realizations and I want to take some action on something. So I'm going to make a plan, right? I'm going to buy some books. I'm going to attend some workshops. I'm going to get some counseling. I'm making a plan, right? It says preparatory. Then there's actually taking action on those plans, right? And then there's maintaining what you are doing and what you have learned from those actions you took. So the people that you are going to be able to grow with, regardless of what attachment style they have, are the people who are able to make plans, take action on them, and maintain their rewards. So maybe you've got someone in the contemplative and preparatory stages. You decide how long you're willing to sit around and wait for them to take action on it. If they don't eventually take action on it, then they're not actually ready, right? They're just kind of appeasing you by contemplating and making plans. I'm doing something, I'm making plans, but they're not actually doing anything, right? They're spinning in circles. They're not ready. They're not. The people that are going to be able to grow with you are the ones that can make plans and take action and maintain the rewards of those actions, even when it's difficult. Because remember, anxiety and avoidance, it's all trying to avoid difficult feelings. Anxious people avoid difficult feelings by reaching outside of themselves to find relief. Avoidant people avoid anxiety by cutting themselves off internally and externally from anything that would create the anxiety. Which means that at the core of someone's avoidance is anxiety, and at the core of someone's anxiety is avoidance, right? So it's not about the attachment style, it's about readiness for change. Hope that helps answer that question. How do you even tell your partner or make them aware of your suspicion that they're dismissive, avoidant without triggering them? So we answered that question very recently in the last live stream that we did. So in essence, you don't tell someone that you think they're avoidant, anxious, whatever. Don't evaluate anybody, right? It's not your job to evaluate someone, particularly not a lover. You say, you share information in a neutral way, right? Looks like my headphones got connected somehow. Let me turn this off. Okay. Can everybody hear me okay? If you can just give me a thumbs up in the chat. It said it switched my mic for a minute there. Okay, great. So if you want to clue someone into the benefits of having this insight into what their attachment style might be, maybe you suspect they're avoidant, maybe you suspect they're anxious or fearful, whatever it is. Those are your own suspicions. Keep them to yourself. What you can do is you can say, hey, I saw this video on this thing called attachment styles, and a few light bulb moments popped up for me. Was wondering what you thought, right? You could add greater emphasis to it. You can say, wow, I just saw this video on the anxious avoidant trap, and it really rung my bell. I thought it'd mean a lot to me if you took a look at it. I'd love to know your thoughts. You want to know how they are interpreting the information. You want to know how they take this and see themselves through this lens, because that's a lot more important information than telling them what you think they are, right? Or getting them to believe what you think they are. Knowing how they see themselves is a lot more important in terms of evaluating your compatibility. And it's also a lot more important in knowing and seeing and understanding what growth is possible with them. Because if they look at that and you can plainly see that they have avoidant tendencies and they say, oh, I'm secure, they got a long way to go. They're not even pre-contemplative, right? Or they're not even contemplative. And and if that's what they think about themselves, they require a lot more exposure or they require a lot more information. Doesn't mean that they're not willing to read it, to absorb it, or to learn it, but it does let you know where they are on that path. And you can make better discerning decisions about, how long you're willing to stick it out with them. Okay, we had another question here. How does an avoidant partner navigate milestones and commitment in a relationship, such as moving in together, getting married? Do they pull back? Okay, I've gotten questions like this before in the past. Sometimes people think that if you can get the avoidant partner to commit, whether it's moving in together or getting married, that somehow they'll feel safe and they'll finally stop being avoidant, and then everything is just going to be the way that you want it to be, right? Everything's going to be secure. It's all going to be hunky-dory. It's not how it goes. I would have you think about avoidance as like a seesaw, or you might even think of it as like an equalizer or a radio dial. When you increase the degree, especially if this is someone who is not working on themselves in therapy, or even in couples counseling, not doing any kind of self-work at all, when you increase the intimacy in one category of your relationship, then in order to maintain that systemic balance, another part is going to have to go down. So if the commitment goes up, then the emotional intimacy has to go down. So maybe they're spending more time with you, but it feels like there's a veil between you. It feels like you're not actually connecting in the time that you spend together. Or maybe the sexual chemistry goes down. You suddenly, the sexual intimacy disappears. Where did that go? Why? Right? So the answer is oftentimes what happens is there's a wobble. And it doesn't mean that they can't eventually steady that wobble. But if you know in advance that they have these tendencies and they're making a huge commitment and it is a milestone or something kind of life altering, there will be a wobble. And it may be in the direction of becoming increasingly secure. Of course, that is possible. So what that looks like is they become increasingly anxious. If they do perceive it as safe enough to confront the fears that keep us locked down in an avoidance state, then that means what happens is they're going to start allowing themselves to feel the anxiety that they've been avoiding for a long time. And it's going to look probably like fearful avoidance for a while, some level of inconsistency, pulling back, moving forward, being vulnerable, being distant, right? They're going to wobble because they haven't spent any time figuring out how to organize and channel the energy that they're now allowing themselves to feel because they finally perceive it as safe enough to feel it, right? So this is why I do suggest that you are in counseling or therapy of some description, particularly if you're getting married, so that there is a buffer in the room that can help you navigate that, because it's just good practice, right? It's just being knowledgeable about what you need, right? It's kind to give that to yourself, and it's kind for them to give that to themselves. I hope that makes sense. Let's see. So many questions today. Can a secure person be interpreted as an avoidant by a very anxious partner? Yes. So remember, these tendencies exist on a spectrum, right? Attachment styles are really just a frequency of thought, attitude, and behavior that occurs together and frequently enough that we're able to call it a pattern. And when we see a pattern occurring, we can put a name to it, like a style, right? So if someone is way over here on the spectrum and they're super anxious, their paradigm for what closeness is going to be extreme, right? It's going to look and feel extreme to someone who's not extreme, right? i.e. someone who's more secure, falls somewhere more in the middle. And it's going to look extremely extreme to someone who's all the way other end of the spectrum, right? So we have to take into consideration, like, our standpoint. Where are we coming from? And I think that's why the healing process is oftentimes kind of a pendulum swing. It's spending time in this extreme, spending time in that extreme, because when you're highly anxious and you don't have a concept for what secure means, and someone tells you, well, to stop being anxious, you need to spend more time alone with yourself, the first thing you're going to think is, oh, well, that must mean that I need to go isolate myself on top of a mountain somewhere and figure out how to be happy while I'm all alone in my room, right? Or figure out how to love myself in isolation. Because that's the only other way you can conceive it, because it's the extreme opposite of what you're currently experiencing, right? So in order for us to navigate gray areas, i.e. the sophistication of evolved and nuanced boundaries, we oftentimes swing from one extreme to the next. So someone who's extremely anxious is more likely than someone else to become extremely avoidant, right? And then they're going to swing back and forth for a while, and as they start navigating the terrain in between, and then eventually, just like a pendulum, they'll find a place of rest. And that's when they will have started to really map out that inner terrain, evaluate their needs, understand both ends of that spectrum. And now they can settle on what are some healthy boundaries that can define what it is I'm really needing and wanting, and the dimensions of compatibility, including my values and priorities and relationships moving forward. That's why it's a process, right? It's a journey. Hope that makes sense. Okay, we had another one. My partner says he wants to take things slow after I said I don't want something casual. What does that mean? So when your partner says that they agree with not having a casual relationship, but then they describe themselves as wanting to take things slow, it usually means that they just move at a slower pace when it comes to emotional intimacy. And people have different timelines for feeling comfortable with deepening the connection. And sometimes we can make generous, loving compromises so that with patience, we might arrive at the same place. But this can also indicate a fundamental incompatibility if you find that over time you are dragging them behind you, right? And so if you feel like you're not fully desired, or like it's as if you have to convince them to be with you, that can trigger deeper wounds. And so it's really essential to ask yourself, how long are you willing to wait, or how much time are you willing to give this relationship an opportunity to grow? And so you want to put a number on it. Maybe it's 3 months, 6 months, and stick to that number. It's also helpful to remember that our attachment system doesn't really express itself in earnest until 3 to 6 months into a relationship, because that's when things start to feel more serious. So that can serve as somewhat of a barometer against which to measure how things are developing. But this is going to be different for every person. So I just invite you to ask yourself those questions and do a deep dive into what would feel right for you. All right, what else? How do I tell an avoidant partner that I love them without scaring them off? Okay. I really like who I am when I'm around you. It feels like the best version of myself. So thank you for just being you. That's how I would say it. Because avoidant partners experience love as something that contributes to their sense of self and well-being. It's less about being preoccupied with making themselves desirable to someone else. It's more about feeling free to be who you are in somebody else's presence. And so the words "I love you" can often be laden with all kinds of emotional baggage. And in their history, loved ones may have used those words as a way to excuse inappropriate or dysfunctional behavior, or even boundary violations. So, well, I love you, so you have to forgive me. Oh, I love you, so you have to do what I say. Well, I love you, so you owe me, right? Or I love you, so now you have to live up to my expectations of what love is, whether or not that has anything to do with you, right? And so avoidant partners are very suspicious of their loved ones being in love with the idea of being in love, and over romanticizing things. And so if when you look at them, you start to see pink fuzzy clouds forming in front of your eyes, they're going to start to feel like they've become obscured. And so that's why the best way to tell them that you love them is to express it in a way that they would feel loved and would understand love. Hope that helps. How to approach an avoidant partner in a long-distance relationship who is pulling back after an argument. If an avoidant partner pulls back in a long-distance relationship after a fight, it's essential to recognize that the space between you has served some kind of protective function for both of you. Otherwise, one or both of you would not have agreed to it, right? So you have to consider how that distance is serving you as much as it is serving them. So in a long-distance relationship, of course, communication becomes profoundly important, because there is so much time and space for fantasy to fill in the gaps. And so when our communication is unclear or ambiguous, then conflicts are likely to erupt because of the fantasy. The fantasy that we've created is being threatened. And with that comes a sense of lack of safety, right? So I suggest giving the relationship a set amount of time to work on those issues. And if the communication does not improve, then it's important to reevaluate, why are you still there, right? And if you're holding on to something that's no longer serving you, how is that keeping you safe, right? So those are some questions that I would leave you with. Okay. So how can you put down an avoidant partner's wall so that they will commit? Well, no matter how deeply you love someone, you can't put down an avoidant partner's wall. They have to do that for themselves. And what you can do is show up with 100% of your good intentions, having learned communication skills based on attachment styles, being mindful of their triggers and their sensitivities, and showing compassion for their needs, while at the same time honoring your needs and values as well, right? So in other words, just being mindful of how you're showing up to the best of your ability and shining just as brightly as you do, and then knowing and trusting that it is up to them to choose to meet you there or not. Because the more that you try to pull something out of them or force some kind of commitment, the more you're just going to wind up pushing them away, right? Let me know in the comments or in the chat if that's been your experience, or if anyone's noticed that, like the harder you try, the worse it gets. Certainly that was my experience in the past, right? Because what happens is when we're doing that in that moment, we're operating under some kind of agenda, and we're trying to squeeze something out of them to meet our own needs, and that creates pressure. And, compatibility is a real thing. You can love someone deeply and still not be compatible in a long-term relationship. Your needs and values have to align for practical reasons, right? And so when we resist the reality of that, we create more friction and pain. So we want to get real clear on what you want from the relationship in general, and then give them the option to join you there or not. And then let go of what you can't control and let yourself grieve it. Because only then that is when what is truly meant for you can actually come in. Right? Okay. Let's see. I have another one here. How can I tell if they really love me, but they're just torn up about it, or they don't really like me? So the difference really only matters insofar as it gives you permission to move on, right? And this person's not likely to give you the clarity that you seek, so you cannot continue to give them that kind of power, right? The fact that you don't know already indicates that you can't trust them because they're not being clear, because their words are not matching up with their actions. And so this relationship is not likely to materialize in any kind of healthy way. I'm sorry. So which option really allows you to let go of them more easily? So option one, he loves you, but he's just so tortured about it that he can't do anything about it anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Or option two, he's keeping you as some kind of, option down the line for himself, which ultimately means that he's using you as some kind of object to satisfy his esteem. So pick the story that serves you best, that gives you the most permission to move on, and run with it. Let it go. Okay? Let it go. Hanging on to it otherwise is a romantic fantasy, and it's going to keep you locked in a cycle. If you are hanging on to it, ask yourself, how is hanging on to this serving me? How is being preoccupied with someone that doesn't show up in a consistent way and clearly choose me keep me protected? Keep me safe. Usually it's safe from being exposed in ways that I'm not ready to be exposed. So you've attracted someone that is unavailable because a part of you is unavailable. So find out what part that is. He broke up with me weeks ago, but is still sharing his location. What does that mean? Okay, so similar to the last one we talked about. When there is ambivalence, take it as a no. So if someone isn't actively making an effort to communicate with you, but they're still sharing their location, right? Or some aspect of their existence on social media, that's a mixed signal that, of course, can feel confusing. But spending time trying to decode that behavior is going to leave you spinning your wheels. The fact is, they're not ready to be present in the relationship, right? So sharing their location without including consistent communication does not indicate investment. It indicates ambiguity and confusion and doubt, and that only adds to the noise. So if you find yourself struggling to let go, it's worth reflecting on, why are you holding on? And ask yourself, how does staying mentally attached and preoccupied to someone who's not willing to make the effort for me, again, keeping me safe? How am I protected by doing that? Again, oftentimes obsessing over someone who's unavailable is a way to avoid vulnerability or making new connections ourselves. And that's our own ambivalence, right? So true clarity comes when we stop waiting for answers from them or for someone else that can interpret them, and instead focusing on what's best for our own emotional well-being, and then shifting our entire focus, energy, and intention towards that aim. Okay. Okay. Can a secure partner or a secure relationship heal an avoidant partner? So while a secure partner can certainly create a safe environment that supports an avoidant partner, it's really important to recognize that healing is ultimately an inside job. A secure partner can be a model for healthy emotional behaviors. They can provide consistent support and offer safety, the safety that an avoidant partner needs to feel comfortable in order to face their fears of emotional risk, right? They can create an atmosphere where vulnerability is less threatening and they're modeling new patterns of relating. But a secure person cannot force someone to heal, right? Certainly not someone who is unwilling to change or is invested in the patterns that they've had up until this point, right? The avoidant partner, or it could even be an anxious partner or a fearful avoidant partner, they have to be open to acknowledging their fears and actively engaging with them. Because both parties, if you're going to heal in a relationship, both parties have to be committed to that growth and to the health of the relationship. But the secure partner's role is simply to offer safety and choice, not to fix that person. And so unless you've got this mutual willingness, the dynamics are going to persist. The secure person may become increasingly insecure if they stick around, right? Despite their best efforts. And so healing really begins when both partners are willing to do the work, right? So again, decide how long you're willing to give it and stick to it. Then let it go. All right. I think we'll do, let's see. Let me know in the chat. Is any of this resonating with you? Can you connect to any of these questions? I'd love to know. Do you have any advice on or insights into avoidance experiencing grief? My partner lost their mother and wondering the best way to help or be there. So how do avoidant people deal with their pain? By going in, right? So it's really just about giving them options, and asking. Not assuming anything, but just asking. You don't have to ask me, just ask them. I can't imagine what you're going through right now. But I want to be here for you in the ways that are helpful. So you can ask them what would be helpful, or if it's too hard for them to figure out what would be helpful, you can give them options, right? Like, would you like me to just sit here and be with you? Would you like to do things and not talk about it at all? Right? Do you want to go watch a stupid movie and spend the afternoon laughing? Or do you just want to be by yourself and crawl into a hole and just have me check on you like every other day or so? Do any of those sound appealing? Right? So it depends on what their level of self-awareness is. If you think that they could tell you what they need, just ask. If you think that they couldn't figure that out, give them some options and see how they respond. Ultimately, their grief is about their process, right? And just the only thing you want to be mindful of is making sure that when you're trying to offer support, that it's really about offering support and it's not about trying to confirm your connection to them because you feel disconnected from them because they are in a difficult place and struggling to connect with themselves, right? Because when we feel grief, especially a deep grief, it's because we feel like we've lost a part of ourselves. So we feel disconnected from ourselves. And that's what grief is. And so when you're with someone who feels disconnected from themselves, you start to feel disconnected from them. And sometimes the help that we're offering is really just about trying to reconnect to them for our own ease. Just be mindful that's not what you're doing. Right. Do you think it's dysfunctional to fight for love instead of two mature people coming together with the intention of creating a relationship that does not involve fighting for love rather than growing in love? So you have to define, what does it mean to fight for love? What does that mean? Does that mean that you're willing to confront uncomfortable feelings and expand your capacity to hold them? Then yes, I think it's worth fighting for love. If fighting for love means that you're ignoring someone's level of readiness because you have an idea about what you think the potential of the relationship might be, and you're not willing to accept that they're not ready for that, so you're going to fight to convince them, in that case, no. That sounds like a lack of acceptance and conditional love, right? It would be unconditional to allow them to be where they are in their stage of readiness and love them for where they are and love yourself for where you are and make decisions knowing and accepting that that's where you both are, right? Now there is a play space somewhere in the middle there where when you come together in a relationship and you learn how to create safety, you've created a sandbox. And in that sandbox, different parts of yourself, inner children, let's say, are going to come out to play. And some parts that have been restricted or constricted for a long time may come out. So maybe there's a part that doesn't want to give you all the answers so easy, doesn't want to directly tell you what they need. They want you to figure it out. And they want you to fight for them. So they limit test you, right? Or they won't tell you what they want for Christmas. You need to figure it out, whatever it is, whatever the degree of severity might be there, right? And so you decide, are you willing to show up for that? Can you have those imperfect interactions that may eventually lead to more stability and security to where they won't be testing you so much? And it's not about fighting for the relationship or not. It's just about, oh, I see you. Oh, I see this situation stimulated a younger part of you. And that definitely triggered something in me. But thankfully, I've done the work and I'm willing to work with this part as long as this part is willing to work with me. And we can talk a little bit about why it felt the need to test and what reassurances it needs. And we can come up with some negotiations and agreements around installing reassurances all along the way, so we don't need to test so much and so often, right? I'm okay. I can play with you in that way, as long as you're willing to play with me in that way. So we don't have to be perfect, these perfect A grade students of self-help and personal development, right? Like sometimes I can be a little bit provocative and sometimes you can be a little bit evasive, and we can build castles and knock them down in the sandbox. Just so long as we know that the sandbox, the frame is intact, let's play a little, right? Really, a secure relationship will be able to withstand that, playing with your avoidant and your anxious parts. Not that you have to fix yourself first and then show up to the relationship. So you have to think about, what are you defining as fighting for? It's kind of a romantic notion. Depends on how you're defining it. So I hope that makes sense. All of this is resonating. You're brilliant. Love listening to your wisdom. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. It's funny because, social media is such an interesting thing. I have lots of videos, on YouTube and Instagram, places like that. So sometimes there's the impression that I'm around a lot, but I work from home. So I spend most of my time by myself in a room that is 6x7. So it's nice to get that feedback. I appreciate that. Okay. All right. So we are at 3:55. I think we could probably do one more. Let's see here. Oh, this one. So I get this question a lot. Are avoidant partners more likely to cheat than anxious partners? So there's no, I've read the research, there's no consistent, outstanding answer to this question. I will say, statistically speaking, the majority of studies I've read would indicate really a slight increase of anxious people being more likely to cheat. Avoidant partners are more flexible, amenable, and open to the idea of multiple partners, but ironically, they are much less likely to pursue it. It's actually anxious people who are, again, slightly more likely to be unfaithful because they struggle with boundaries, and or because they are seeking some kind of emotional affirmation or validation in that exchange. I will say, anecdotally speaking, I've noticed that when avoidant partners are unfaithful, it's usually, it either has nothing to do with their feelings for their primary partner, like at all, and they have no intention of changing anything about their primary relationship. If it has something to do with their primary partner, it's because the affair is creating enough emotional distance so that they feel like they're exercising their autonomy, which allows them to stay in the primary relationship. Or they may be doing it as a way to act out and put their primary partner in their place, so to speak. Whereas for anxious partners, again, it's usually more about receiving some kind of emotional validation or affirmations, getting a need met that's not being met at home or otherwise. Sometimes it can be about acting out. It's a way of getting the attention of their partner. I will say the studies also show that anxious partners who are unfaithful are also a lot more twisted up about it, usually because it contradicts their values, right? It contradicts their consciously held values, whereas not so much for avoidant partners, right? So they feel this compulsion towards it, but it contradicts the value that they have around loyalty. So if they follow the compulsion, then they beat themselves up about it. And so then, they start condemning their needs, that kind of thing. But I do have a video on my YouTube channel about it, which is called Six Types of Cheaters. And it just goes into the different types, different scenarios that we can find around things like infidelity. But I mean, all of that said, there's no real, I would say, there's no real consensus across the board about that. Not really. I hope that helps. Let's see. Okay, so with that, I think we'll probably bring it to a close here for today. Thank you everyone for joining me here live. I super appreciate it. Again, to those of you who are my students, you can, as a reminder, we will be coming back on the third Thursday of the month. Sometimes the date changes. As long as you add the Google Calendar to your scheduler, you'll receive the notifications. And all that is available inside your student dashboard. The replays are inside your student dashboard under the live events and replays module. You can also submit your questions in advance through there as well. Thank you, everyone. I hope that you have enjoyed our discussion here today, and I look forward to seeing you again in a couple